Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's webinar, Climate Anxiety, How to Address Eco and Climate Trauma with Children. This evening's webinar is part of a series, parent education series hosted by San Mateo County Office of Education. I am Carla Rodriguez, project specialist, focused on family and community engagement with San Mateo County Office of Education. Before I introduce and welcome our presenter this evening, just wanted to share a couple of housekeeping reminders that tonight's webinar will be recorded and posted on San Mateo County's Office of Education's YouTube channel. So you'll have the opportunity to share and with any community members who couldn't make it this evening. Throughout tonight's webinar, I believe the chat function, yes, is enabled. So feel free to, pose questions, thoughts in chat, and there'll be moments that throughout the webinar that we may be pausing to answer some questions, and definitely we'll have time at the end for a discussion. If there is any need for Spanish language interpretation services, please let me know. I believe there's yes, there is a Spanish interpretation, but just if you can just let me know, like via chat, I will connect you to interpretation. So without further ado, once again, I welcome you to tonight's webinar titled Climate Anxiety, How to Address Eco and Climate Trauma with Children. Tonight, we'll have the opportunity to learn more about how the environmental and climate crisis impacts children and youth. In tonight's webinar, we'll receive resources and tools that you can use at home or in school-based programs to help children and youth and yourself shift from despair and anxiety to empowerment and hope. Our presenter this evening is Andrea Yonkelan, is the Environmental Literacy Coordinator at the San Mateo County Office of Education. She currently provides visionary leadership in implementing a broad environmental literacy initiative that calls for whole school sustainability integration across all facets of an institution: campus and operations, curriculum and instruction, community engagement, and organizational culture. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And it's my pleasure to now hand it over to Andrea. Thank you, Andrea. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. So I'm excited to be here and to speak with everyone tonight. And we will have some elements of the presentation that are interactive. So looking forward to also hearing more from the different participants and some of the issues and concerns that you all have about climate change and about how to address that with children and youth. So I'm going to put in the chat box, if you're somebody who likes to follow along, I'm going to put the slides in the chat box, and then I'll go ahead and share my screen as well for those of you who are able to visually see it. So I'll just start off by saying that Carla mentioned this, but my role at the county office is to oversee a broad environmental literacy and sustainability initiative. And we launched that work in 2017. And our mission is really to provide backbone support to our schools to help them prioritize environmental literacy, integrate environmental sustainability, and also do climate resiliency. And we really see that happening across the school's campus, curriculum, community, and culture. And the items that we're going to talk about tonight really address all those different things. And we'll get into, when we get into like the solutionary part in school-based settings and how parents and guardians and families can advocate for that work in a school-based setting, hopefully this mission will really become clear. So like I said, we are doing this work across the campus, curriculum, community, and culture, and we really do work with all different stakeholders. So we run some specific programs that are capacity building programs for teachers and administrators and youth leaders. We also run a number of different networks that are all about like elevating change makers and connecting different change makers to partners who can help really catalyze this work and move it forward. And we also provide customized technical assistance. So I'm excited to be really talking here to this family audience and also educator audience, and really help to show different ways that you can think about these topics for both home and for classroom use as well. So I'll just start here getting into the heart of the presentation by answering this question, which is, how does the environment and climate crisis impact physical and mental health of our students? So for this section, I just want to make sure that we all have a grounding foundation in the concept of trauma. So here we have a definition that really highlights what trauma is all about. So I'm going to read it for folks that are not able to see. So trauma is the response to a distressing or disturbing event, or series of factors that overwhelm an individual's ability to cope or causes feelings of helplessness or diminishes their sense of self or their ability to feel the full range of emotions and experiences. So I think a lot of folks are probably pretty familiar with trauma, but if you're not, there's different levels and layers of trauma that researchers and mental health professionals are really coming to understand. So I'm going to share here this idea of ACEs, which are the adverse childhood experiences. And this is really looking at the individual trauma that can happen typically in a home-based setting. So, or not always has to be at home, can also be in other places, but we're really talking about the individual level here. And different things that could happen are abuse, neglect, or even household dysfunction. So all these things can really lead to negative results like mental illness and substance abuse for when children grow up to become adults, and even can struggle with job opportunities and earning potential. So already we know that so many children and youth in our communities are struggling with these adverse childhood experiences. So I want to now go a little bit further on that and talk about how this type of adverse childhood experiences are not the only thing that our kids are experiencing. They're also experiencing environmental injustice. And so I want to just share an image here that for those of you who can see it, there's a couple different images on the screen. So there's one here of a Chevron oil refinery flaring up in Richmond. Poor air pollution. This is a San Joaquin example. Trash throughout Oakland and the Santa Barbara oil spill. And then just another map that shows all the different water pollution hotspots across the state. So I'm going to pause here and just ask you to think about, when you see these images and you see the different things here, what emotions come up for you? And if you'd like, I'll invite you to put that in the chat box just so we can get a sense of kind of what is coming up for people. And if you'd like, you can also come off mute and share the emotions that you feel as you see these issues. Yeah, so I'm seeing things like anxiety, anger, grief, disgust, right? I think a lot of people, that resonates with a lot of people, and also fear, right? I'll also invite you to think about which populations really bear the brunt of these environmental injustices. And probably you're thinking now in your head, and you may even want to put that in the chat box, lower income communities, oftentimes communities of color, different areas are really experiencing these injustices disproportionately to others. And this really impacts health. So no matter what, no matter who you are, if you're experiencing any of these things, they have an impact on your health. So the World Health Organization really outlined how all these different issues like air pollution and chemicals and radiation and all these different factors can actually really have a pretty deep impact on the physical health that people experience. And on the mental health side of it and physical health side of it, this has been paired now with the adverse childhood experiences that you saw before. And now you've got these community experiences that can compound trauma. So this is often referred to as the pair of ACEs. So I just wanted to show this here so people had a better sense of it. The bottom here, oftentimes all those environmental issues are lumped into this idea of poor housing quality and affordability. Like all those issues can be in any housing situation, but like I said before, they are disproportionately impacting folks who are living in poor housing conditions. So I also just want to give this as a resource here. And this is all these resources you can find in the slide deck. So I'll just put that slide deck in the chat box one more time just to make sure people have it. But you are able to actually take a look at this resource, which is looking at how these impacts take place across California. And this comes from Cal EnviroScreen. So if you want to get a better sense of some of the environmental injustices or some of the ongoing chronic traumas that your community may be experiencing because of environmental injustice, you can take a look here at this map tool. Sorry, this is every time you open it for the first time, it asks you to go through like looking at the different things. So I'll jump out of there for now, but I'll just share that this tool shows you where the pollution burdens are and also some of the other environmental effects, and they overlay that with different population characteristics. And when you look closer at the map, you'll see that the spots that are red are where they're experiencing the most environmental injustice and the most challenging population characteristics indicators as well. And we definitely have a lot of that throughout San Mateo County in specific hotspots. So I encourage you to use that map as a tool and get a better feel for what might be going on right there in your community. And I'll put that link to the Calendar screen in the chat box as well. So that's what's going on with just general environmental injustice. I now want to just add on one more layer, which is connecting climate change and trauma. So I'll give you a chance to take a look at these images as well and really think about, again, what emotions come up for you as you look at these images and which populations are most vulnerable to these impacts. And you're welcome again to put any response in the chat box so people can get a sense of where you're at. Yeah, so I see a fair amount of similar responses, right? Like fear, anger, helplessness. These climate issues are very real and present in San Mateo County. So right now in our county, we have the least amount of air conditioners per capita in the state. So as heat increases, that really becomes an issue for our county. Fires contributed to the most school closure days in California in the past couple of years, and that aside from COVID, sorry, I should have clarified that, but that is really increasing in its impact for our students. And then also our students are experiencing canceled activities when there are air quality issues. Extreme precipitation, such as flooding, has happened in a few of our schools during these atmospheric river issues. And then also our San Mateo County is the most vulnerable county to sea level rise. And we already have 34 schools that are vulnerable to that in this decade. So experiencing ongoing sea level rise issues. So the climate impacts are very real and they're impacting across our county. And of course, they are impacting certain populations disproportionately to others, but it is affecting everybody at the same time. So to add on to those pair of ACEs that you saw before, so you've got the first individual childhood household issues, then you've got the community environmental trauma that I mentioned, and now you can also add this layer of climate trauma. So our students and our children are experiencing all of these things. And that's really concerning. And the research shows that the climate risk index is, when we talk about most vulnerable populations, of course, it's important to mention the populations we already discussed, like lower income communities, communities of color, but also just every single child is experiencing climate injustice. Currently, almost every child on Earth is exposed to at least one climate shock that is disproportionately worse than their parents had to experience. And children born in 2020 are going to experience a significant increase in disasters compared to older generations. So we're seeing that this is really an intergenerational injustice for children. And the World Health Organization has shared that this is really concerning because some of these issues have both a physical element, so physical health, but also mental health as well. And the World Health Organization is not the only one who's concerned about this. The CDC is very concerned about this as well, looking at the impacts of climate change on human health. And again, really thinking about this through the lens of physical health, but also mental health. And so is the APA. So we've got a lot of different agencies recognizing that hey, we really need to think about how this is impacting our children. And then, of course, the youth have been saying it, right? If you look at some of the research that's out there, 3/4 of youth say that they thought that the future was really frightening. Over half have reported to say that humanity is doomed. And many of those questioned in these surveys feel betrayed or ignored or abandoned by politicians and adults. And that can feel really overwhelming looking at that. And that was a global survey that was done. So I want to just pause here and get a chance to reflect and give people time to think about these questions. And we can open it up for a discussion as well, but give people a chance to discuss like what environmental issues and climate crisis issues feel most relevant to you as we went through all those different things. What emotions and concerns come up for you as you look at that data and those frameworks? And then what question do you have that you want to explore more? And actually, I'm thinking it might be helpful if we pause and go into some breakout rooms so that people get a chance to actually have some smaller discussions. So I'm going to set that up right now and give people a chance to do that. Well, thank you so much for diving in with your groups and getting a chance to to go a little bit deeper and check in with folks. I realized I just have to apologize. I forgot to put this resource in the chat box in the very beginning. I was so busy putting the slide deck in. This document that I just put in the chat box, and I'll share my screen, has pretty much all the things I just shared in that presentation. It's got all those different elements outlined here. So if you want to dive deeper into some of these resources, just to better understand like some of these, some of these thought leaders or some of these articles about where students are at, you can check that out there. And then we're going to use this document in the last half of the workshop as well, so people can really dive into it a little bit more when we go a little bit further.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll be there.
So does anybody have any comments or questions after that segment that they wanted to share out with everybody after talking kind of through where you're at and what resonated with you and what fears you might have? Okay, then I will go into the next segment then, which is really about what resources are available. And we're going to look at this in two different parts. So I'm going to start with what resources are available to parents, guardians, and families to address this crisis outside of school. And then we'll talk about what can you do inside of school to really empower and to advocate so that you can do that. And I know that some of you are wearing multiple hats tonight. Some of you are wearing an educator hat and a parent hat. But we're going to start first with just thinking about this crisis outside of school. So I am a parent, and I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. And I had my first child in 2015, and it was kind of during the time, actually, I'll stop sharing my screen here for a second. It was kind of during the time when like climate change was still very far in the distant future. And the way it was talked about was like, we're not quite experiencing it yet, or if we are, it's not too bad, but like really, it's going to be really bad in 2100. And I was like, okay, that's really scary. And I'm worried for my child that I just had. But like, I still feel like, we're going to have a good quality of life. When I had my second child in 2017, the message was already shifting quite a bit. And then by 2018, before her first birthday, the IPCC report came out and was like, nope, we're experiencing climate change right now. It's going to be global chaos by 2050, and buckle down, folks. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like, what have I done? And I knew in my job, it's already stressful enough doing this job, but then thinking about being a parent as well and how to do this with my kids, it's just been really overwhelming. Some days are just overwhelming. And so I wanted to let folks know that that there's a lot of resources available to you. But yes, Allison, like you said, that acceleration is terrifying, and it's happening so quickly that you can even feel like probably your own quality of life has maybe declined just because of certain things. And in some ways it's better, right? So there's this space that we go in that's like really scary and terrifying when we think about what are our children going to deal with and what are we dealing with. And then there's this other realization I have that's like, oh, well, actually the air quality is a little bit better than it used to be when you'd go down to Southern California, and it would be like black air and you'd have like black boogers after like going, around like Los Angeles area. So I do think that there has been some improvement, but obviously it's not enough. And it's not going to get us where we need to get. And so we need a lot more. But how do we deal with all those fears? That's what we want to talk about today. So I'm going to share some resources that are available to you, and really, again, have that lens of right now it's outside of school. So one thing I will just say is that a really key thing that people want to think about is to stay informed. So I think that it's like, sometimes you just want to like bury your head and not look at those, like not look at the news, not look at the things that are going on. But I think because this crisis is accelerating so quickly, it's really important to stay informed on both the problems and the solutions so that you can help navigate that conversation with your kids. And who knows where they're accessing their information, right? It could be friends, it could be social media, it could be the news, it could be wherever. And so if you can stay informed, then you can help make sure that your children have access to like high quality information, and you can kind of check if there's misinformation. The other thing I would say is just listen and validate. And sorry, I should have said this before as well. All of these strategies are coming also from like health professionals. So these are ones that I've tried with my kids, but also these are ones that are recommended by health professionals. So listen and validate, right? Let your kids talk about this if they need to, and validate their fears that they may be having. Oftentimes younger ones may have less fears because they don't know to be afraid because it's always been, right? Like I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and they don't know anything different than wildfire season, right? They don't know that there was not really a wildfire season even 10 years ago. There was just like occasional wildfires, and it was like a big deal. Now there's a whole season. And we have a little word wall in our house that's like in September, it's like smoke and air quality and wildfires. And like, I sometimes look at that and I'm like, oh my gosh, but it allows them to be able to like express their feelings. And that actually brings me to this third one, which is initiate the conversation. Sometimes kids don't even know that they want to have the conversation. So it's important as parents and guardians that we offer up that space to initiate the conversation. And sometimes they might just be like, whatever, please stop talking about that. But other times they'll open up and share their feelings about it. The next bullet point is really about planning for resilience. So I encourage folks to really think about how you and your family can be resilient through some of these challenges. So making sure that you do have a safety plan for wildfires if they come to your community, making sure you do have a ability to deal with wildfire smoke when it comes. So thinking about like, if you can, thinking about air quality control things, having the right masks for smoke, having all these different things. So really planning for that resilience so that you and your family can be safe during these challenges. And then taking action in your home or your community. So that kind of shifts from the like, okay, we're just talking about it, or we're like planning for it, but actually we're taking action, and we're going to be as sustainable as we can be in our home. And we're going to help others in our community to be sustainable as well. So those are just some really high level strategies. I want to make sure that people also get a couple of resources here. So all these different articles I'm sharing in the slide deck are from like really recent articles that have like that really reinforce some of these strategies that are listed here. But other kind of really practical things, especially things that you can do with your children, are like just having some books around that address solutionary and environmental issues. So this book list right here has like solutionary books that really have a positive feeling about like how you can change the world, how you can make a difference. And then there's also a bunch of fiction books as well. And there are some here that have solutionary action. And then there's just a ton of different environmental books that we recommend and have this. These are all very well vetted resources that have been used both in the classroom and in the home. There's children's books here, there's youth books. If you're a parent or guardian who wants to think about them by like age range, you can, some of these have been organized by elementary or secondary. And then there's also a section here by different topics. So if you want to dive into some of these and say like, okay, my kids seem really interested in this topic of energy, I'd love to be able to like talk about it more with them, take a look at some of these books. And all of these links, for the most part, will take you to a read aloud. So that's something you don't have to buy the books. You can also check and see if they're in your local library. But these are all great ones that I just highly recommend. And if you've got older students, like there's a lot of children's books in here, but if you have older children, take a look at some of the youth books as well. And hopefully that'll be a good start for your family to just start dialoguing a little bit more based on the literature here. So I'll put that in the chat box as well so that it's easy for you to pull it up. And then I also just want to share another thing that you can do with your family is to really think about connecting to nature and building in a regular nature connection activity into your family experience. I know a lot of people, that was one of those positive unintended consequences of COVID, is that a lot of people found the outdoors to be this refuge. And not everybody has easy access to the outdoors, but if you can figure out how to build that into your routine, I highly recommend it. I know with me and my children, we live in East Oakland in an apartment building and are up on the 3rd floor. And it's not really that easy to get out into nature for us. And we, when we look outside our balcony, we pretty much just see intense environmental injustice. We're right in a transportation corridor. We have a train that goes right past our house. And so sometimes the outside can almost feel really scary. And when we walk outside, there's just pollution everywhere. And so I really work to balance that with my kids. And sometimes we have nature connection time that's not outside, but it's inside. We have a lot of houseplants inside. My other co-parent has a dog. And so they have their nature connection time with the dog. So there's lots of things that you can do both indoors and outdoors to really try to do this. And if you can find a favorite spot in your neighborhood, like maybe it's a favorite tree, and you actually spend some time with your kids going and saying hi to that tree regularly and doing things like that. So focusing in on trees can be a great one. Or you can do, if you, again, don't have that great of access to outdoors, you could do nature meditations with your kids. So there's a lot of things here that are appealing to both younger kids and older kids. But the main takeaway that I always have for people is just think about how you can make it a routine that you have in your home. So that's another resource there. One other thing that I wanted to share before we close out this little segment about what you can do in your family life is to really think about getting involved with youth and adult-led advocacy groups. So this slide has a bunch of different groups on it. But what I would say is that if you want to get involved in some of these advocacy groups, there's just a ton of them out there. And it gives your children or your youth an understanding that there are a lot of people who care and they're really working hard to elevate their voice and to make change happen. So it can be a really positive experience. If you are looking for different groups, we've put together a list of which ones are youth-led and which ones are adult-led. So that's a spreadsheet that's available to folks. I'll put that in the chat box as well. There's just a ton of different organizations that students and children can get involved with. I also put this little list together specifically for this group. These are all the different groups that are really, really directed towards parents. So I'll put that list in the chat box. There's some ones just for mothers. There's some ones just for dads. There's some ones for families. There's some ones for grandparents. So there's a ton of different climate groups to get involved with if you are interested in more of that advocacy space. This one was more like action-based. This one is more like advocacy-based. So hopefully that gives you a little ideas of like different things you could do. But I do want to pause and reflect and give people a chance to share out like, what strategies have you already tried with your kids? What's worked? What hasn't? Are you participating in any advocacy networks? And what might be concerns you have about your children participating in some of those advocacy networks? So I'm going to put those questions in the chat box, and then I'll give people a chance to reconnect in some breakout rooms so that you can have a little conversation around these issues of like, yeah, I've actually tried some of these strategies. It either worked or it didn't, or also that advocacy pathway. So I'm going to open up those rooms and give you a chance to connect on that. So as we come back into this main room, I just want to say appreciate you all for diving back into those groups. And I want to open up the space and see if anybody wants to share out about strategies that have worked or haven't worked, or if you have any questions. Okay, so if not, I'll keep going and get into the school-based side of it. One thing I did want to say too, though, that after listening to both rooms, I added one more strategy that I should have had in there before, but it's okay to have both outrage and optimism. So that's a great title of a podcast that I love listening to, a climate podcast, but just recognizing that this issue really calls for both. That sometimes the two can help, like having the two simultaneously can actually be helpful, because one keeps you like, oh, I got to do something about this, and the other one keeps you hopeful that change is really possible. And I wear those two daily, and I go between them constantly. But really having just that mindset that like we can make change happen. All of these issues are human created, and therefore they can be changed. And they are being changed right now. A couple of adult resources that I would offer. This little book, Drawdown, I think, oops, now I have this blurred background, so that's not the best. This little book called Drawdown is a great book, because you can just look at that there's actually like 100 different solutions out there that you could do, and that could be implemented. Thank you. I'm going to figure out how to make my background not so crazy. But that's a great book. I used to read one solution every night, and that was like the best, like 100 days of my life, right? Because I was just feeling so positive. They actually just did a new version of it called Regeneration. So that's another one that I recommend, that same idea, just kind of brings you through these solutions and how they are possible and how they are being implemented around the world. So that's a nice way to stay happy as an adult. All right, well, I want to make sure that we finish out here by talking about how schools can integrate trauma-informed practices. So I'll take us into this space of really understanding that schools can do a lot, and parents and guardians can really get involved to help make sure that their schools are doing these things. So in our county, we use this framework when we talk about trauma-informed practices, which is really looking at all these different ways that we can help our schools deal with that trauma that we mentioned before. Primarily, this framework was geared towards this first round of ACEs, but it can also be applicable to the environment and climate. So the pair of ACEs and then the climate ACEs as well. It works for all of it. And so I'm going to walk us through just a couple of those. And you can find the analysis of the connection to this trauma-informed practice in the resource that I shared before, which is right here. And I'm just going to walk through a couple of these little bubbles so that it's a little bit more obvious what we're talking about. So the first two that I'm going to look at is understanding trauma and stress, and then really thinking about resilience and social and emotional wellness. So I'm going to share my screen here and just say that, like, sometimes our kids are showing these symptoms and we don't really know what's going on. And sometimes they're misunderstood, right? People think that they're like willfully doing this, or some people will even use phrases when they see people do this, like, oh, they're sick or they're crazy. But it's not really about that. It's really about that feeling of being overwhelmed and having no other way to express what you're feeling aside from these indicators. So what can educators and families do to really understand this is that we can recognize that many of our kids are living with daily chronic environmental injustice, and that stress is going to show up. And when it flares up, like when we have extremely bad air quality days, or when we have a recent chemical spill or something like that those kids are going to show up with more trauma and with more of these indicators than usual. Or if it's climate related, when we are in like the wildfire season or extreme heat days or drought, or like one of those like overwhelming atmospheric rivers, it's not the same old rainy day like it used to be. Or it's not like, I really hate when people are like, oh, a smoke day, it's like a snow day. I'm like, yeah, except for not fun at all. It's super scary. And it's just important that people recognize that is causing trauma and stress, and that we implement solutions that have to do with resilience and social and emotional wellness. So I'll go to the next slide to talk about that a little bit more. So I already shared these different examples of the solutionary books, but what schools can do is that they can understand that, and they can put together the proper resources to support kids. So having some of these books on hand is really critical, especially when we have like climate disasters happen. Having a book on hand that's about wildfires, or a book that's about drought, or a book that's about whatever, or about like heat and issues around heat, it really helps students to go through it on that day that we're experiencing it at its height, or during that week, or during that season. Just giving a kids a chance to open up that conversation. Oops, sorry, Also, the nature connection activities, the more that schools can do to have spaces that are outdoors, the better. School is one of the most equitable access that kids are going to have to the outdoors, but they have to build that into their infrastructure spaces. And you can see, I'll just open up that document so you can see what I'm talking about. If you go into the document, down, I list like the page numbers there, down on page 3 and 4, that's where it actually shows like, what could you do in curriculum? What could you do in the campus? What can you do in the community to really address these issues? And parents are a very critical voice in this conversation, like coming to parent input nights that have to do with the LCAP or have to do with like PTA nights, anything like that, where you can put parent input in. Advocate for these things, advocate for different books in the library, different books in the classroom, more outdoor learning spaces. All that stuff is going to benefit kids. I want to touch now on compassion and dependability. So we know that trauma can leave people feeling isolated or betrayed, and we're seeing that intergenerational feeling really come through with the climate movement. So what can educators do in their campus to repair that trust between the generations is super, super critical. So right now we've got youth suing the government for inaction on climate change. And we have youth protests all over the world going on where kids are like, what's the point of school if we're going to die anyway, right? Like that's the phrasing that kids are using. And that's really scary to think that kids are having those thoughts. And we as educators or we as parents want to help repair that trust and say, actually, school's a place where we can make change happen. We don't need to walk out of school. We want to walk into school and really do that. So educators can do things in their campus and curriculum and community to really repair that trust. And some of those ideas are down here. So there's things that you can do, like hosting a town hall where people get to share their voice. Building in the environmental principles and concepts into curriculum, and opportunities for kids to do solutionary learning where they actually get to bring solutions forward. And then really prioritizing green facilities, things that mitigate climate change. It shows that you care, and it shows that the school believes that the kids' future really does matter. And then one thing I would just say here for this image is that oftentimes when we talk about different generations doing something, like I often hear like this version of it on the left, which is like, oh, children, like you're the ones who are going to have to save the world, which is really sad to think that we're putting this on the shoulders of children. And it shouldn't just be adults either, right? Like what we want is somewhere in between. So that compassion and dependability has to do with changing the image in our heads and showing intergenerationally working towards this together. And of course, I'm going to always advocate to do that at school. The last one I think that I want to take folks through is this one here, which has to do with safety and predictability. So I mentioned before that understanding trauma and stress, well, having predictability is important. And there's a lot of changes that school can make in planning and in school operations to really account for climate disasters. Like we understand that fall season, you're going to have drought, wildfire, high heat. We understand that in winter, when rain happens, it's coming now in atmospheric rivers, and it's critical to have things in place to deal with flooding. So we can do things in our buildings and in our grounds to have that predictability. And we can do things in our curriculum to get ahead of that and thinking about like, oh, since I know that that's going to happen, maybe I'll build a unit around that in the curriculum. And parents can advocate for that. So they can advocate to say like, I really want these topics talked about in my kids' class so that they feel like they're navigating it at school and that they're getting things that are really important. And it can be on a seasonal predictable schedule. So yeah, this is just really, again, reinforcing this idea that a lot of these issues are predictable in when they're going to happen. And so just getting ahead of that as educators and as parents is important. So the last thing here has to do with empowerment. So always I want to move people into the space that like you can make change happen yourself. We saw this survey in 2020 where kids were just saying again that it made them feel scared or made them feel angry, and very few felt optimistic. But kids who are engaged in action feel extremely optimistic. And I know that just from running a youth leadership program in the county on this topic. The kids enter the program, usually like 90% say they don't feel empowered, they don't know what to do. When they exit, it's the difference. It's 90% are like, I feel like I can make a difference in the world and change things. And it's because they have to do an action-based project. So I encourage folks to get involved and think about what could actually change at their school. We have a ton of resources available on this website. It's all about like how to actually do this on the campuses. So this website has a toolkit that's based on these different focus areas. So if you as a parent want to lead something on a school campus, there's a ton of tools to do that. We have also helped a number of school districts launch district-wide sustainability committees or site-level sustainability committees. And that's becoming increasingly popular. And in these committees, there are youth, there are teachers, there are principals, there are board members, there are district members. So it's one of those opportunities to do this like intergenerational dialogue about how do we want to see this change happen across our school. So this is a resource that's available for folks if they want to better understand how you set up a committee like that. And then there's also case studies on a couple of the districts here in our county who are actually doing that. So there's one on the San Mateo Union High School District, Cabrillo, Sequoia, and Ravenswood. So you can get a sense of like, what does this really look like in school districts that are actually in San Mateo County? So I highly recommend checking that out and thinking about as a parent how you could get involved with something like that. And then, yeah, I think that's enough of going through all those different things. So I'll just, again, give us a chance to just pause and reflect and give people a moment to think about like what practices might be a good entry point for you. How might you support your school community to do this? And who's a champion that you could get involved with right off the bat to get started with this? So I'll just pause and open it up for any questions that people might have about this topic or about how to get started.
Hi, Andra. Thank you for all of this information. This is Niambi.
Hi.
The books that you mentioned that had like just simple things, I'm on here for myself. So I'll say that first.
Excellent.
It just to learn and to deal with my own issues. But the book that you mentioned that you said had like just simple things you can do, is it also those two that you held up in the slides?
Yeah. So these ones that are, it's called Drawdown. It's coming from that. Oops, I held up the wrong one. This one is called Drawdown. So this one is great to just understand the bigger picture of like what's globally happening. But the book list that I put out before is really more about like books you could do with kids. But I do have a couple of other, I'll throw, you know what I'll do later? I'm going to throw onto that solutionary book list that you saw earlier, a couple more that are geared for adults in the climate justice part. Cause I think that would be good to include those because I think they're good for youth as well. But that's what I recommend as a starting point. I have a couple of other ones that I read that have to do with like climate stories, in particular climate stories from women, where women are taking action around the world. So that's another one that I would recommend. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that list for students and children. We actually engaged in a similar process where I reached out to our local library to ask for books actually by theme. And so when I saw that section 5, I'm like, yes, because each of our grade levels here has selected an environmental theme because we're working toward becoming an environmental school. And with more an environmental science and sustainability focus. And so, yeah, that is a really huge help. And I've already sent it to my staff. So looking forward to seeing more of those titles on campus. So thank you.
Great.
Hi, I'm calling in from the telephone. I don't know if you can hear me. This is
Yeah, we can
Jane.
hear you.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your talk. I just love it. And as I shared with my little breakout group, I'm a psychotherapist who specializes in climate anxiety. And I've run a wellness program with a lot of ideas about climate change and what you can do. And I also teach people about how to get off of gasoline and switch over to electric vehicles. My girlfriend, Janelle London, recently wrote a wonderful book for kids called Sparky's Electrifying Adventure. Just trying to double check the title here. Sparky's Electrifying Tale, I'm sorry. And it's designed for children, and it's just about how easy and wonderful and important it is to get off of the gasoline habit. And so I just want to recommend that book, put it in your resources. And also remind you of the good old Dr. Seuss book about the Lorax. You probably have that on your list already, but
yeah, that's a great one.
That's a great one. But this one about Sparky is because the electric vehicle switch is so impactful. It's one of the most impactful things you can do, and kids love to learn about it. And that's, so I just want to put in a big plug for that. No pun intended.
Great. Thank you for sharing that.
And let me just also add one more thing, and that is my little group is teaching a class on electric vehicle switching for Palo Alto Adult School on April 27th, if anybody is interested or thinking about it. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing that. And we are, I will say that myself and my team of Climate Corps Fellows are available to give any presentations to parent groups at schools. If people have a parent group that they think would want to see, a modified version of this or a similar presentation, that's available. Great. Well, any other questions?
Are you good? I'm sorry. Did you decide to save the chat in case any of us who aren't able to do it, because we're not online? Is that something that'll be saved?
Yeah,
also?
Carla said that, yes, that will be available. And then everything, for the most part, all the things I put in the chat are also available in the notes of the slide deck. So if the only thing that you find is the slide deck, you should be taken care of.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yes, but just to reiterate, yes, everyone who registered for this webinar will be receiving all the resources that have been shared via chat and the slides. So you'll have that for your reference.
Awesome. Well,
Thank
I
you.
think we could probably wrap this up then, Carla. I don't know if you have to say something official as you close out for the recording, but I just really appreciate people taking the time here together, and we'll stay in dialogue together. If you have any issues, don't ever hesitate to reach out, or any questions about these topics. Really would just happy to help you out with that.
Yes, so thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this evening's important conversation with Andrea. Thank you, Andrea, for sharing your expertise and just a wealth of resources. Once again, I have saved the chat, and I will be following up with everyone who registered with all the resources, and including Andrea's contact information if you'd like to follow up with her directly. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and take good care.